Hey everybody, this is Allan Ting, TEDx speaker, #1 bestselling author, and founder of Remarkable Parenting Academy. And welcome to another episode of Expert Series Interview. And today we have a very special guest. I'm really excited about this interview. His name is Michael Quan. He's a speaker, #1 international bestselling author of the book, The Fire Planner. And also he's an educator as well. He's been on Good Morning America, which is a huge deal, right? And also CBS. He's also a celebrity. Now he's on a mission to help others achieve financial freedom while finding joy throughout this journey. So we're super excited to have him on board. Welcome, Michael.
Allan, thank you so much for having me. I don't know if I'd call myself a celebrity, but I would say that I like to share information that people can use and find freedom for themselves.
For sure. And today this topic is really relevant because the topic is about what is your idea of a rich life, right? Because the way we think like rich life would be like the millionaires or multi-billionaires, the yacht, the house, the fancy house, the Ferraris, like all the luxury goods, the Louis Vuitton, the Chanel bags and caviar, champagne, all of that, right? So let's talk more about that, because one thing that really struck me with your recent talk recently, it's like, if we were to design our life to have a rich life, what would that look like? And it really started from that. And I'm like, wow, that's a really, really powerful question, because most of the time we kind of just go through the grind. I call it the proverbial hamster wheel, right? We jump on a hamster wheel, goes round and round and round and round, try to make all this money and help our kids, things like that. But we never really take a chance to step back and really design our life. So what is life is all about? Like when you talk about rich life, what is your definition of rich life?
Yeah, that's a great question, Allan. And what I think is interesting is that for all of us, I think our idea of a rich life evolves. It changes over time. So, when I was a kid, my idea of a rich life was getting a Ferrari, having a private jet, having a yacht, and having 3 kids and a mansion, right? That's how we used to play this game called MASH, where you would kind of go around and choose different things, and by certain circumstances and chance, you would choose these different things to create your ideal life. And I remember as a kid, that's just what I thought was getting things. And so that was my idea of a rich life. And then lo and behold, you start to grow up, you start to buy things, if you're lucky, right? Or you might get certain gifts. Maybe you're really wanting a certain toy for a holiday, or maybe you get some money, red envelope money, and then you just spend it all on something that you wanted super, super bad. And then you get it, and then you're like, oh, this is great. But then that feeling fades away. And so what people find, I think listeners, what you've found over time, right, is that as you buy things, it doesn't last, because there's always this craving for more. So you might get this little dopamine hit in the beginning, but then you want more. And so as we grow up, we start to kind of learn these different things. And I got to a certain point in my life where I was like, this is fun to buy things, but it doesn't last. And so what really does last? And I started reading lots of books, Allan. I was very fortunate that I had a couple of uncles that, had done very well for themselves. And I saw them optimizing for their life experiences, meaning that they were really optimizing for relationships, for experiences. And so I started to adopt some of that mindset. And so that's now where a lot of my values come from. And so my idea of a rich life currently is being able to do what I want, whenever I want, with who I want, while still having fun, growing and contributing simultaneously. So that's my idea of a rich life now. I just said, it's evolved differently over the different decades of my life.
Wow, I love that, because a lot of times a lot of people are like, I got to make that first $1 million. I got to make that $10 million, right? And then what do they do? They handcuff themselves into life. What's that saying? Most Americans work for life, whereas most Europeans make life for work, right? There's a huge difference if you really think about it. They're the same words, but if you switch the syntax around, you have different meanings. So I love everything you mentioned. Now you mentioned about early on, oh, by the way, one thing I forgot to mention about Michael is you got to retire at age 36, right? So you're like, I'm done. I don't need to work anymore. I made all my money. So now you get a chance to go play and do whatever you want in your life. How amazing and fantastic is that, right? So think about it. If you had a choice, right, in life, and you're like, I can do whatever I want, whenever I want, however long I want it, and just be happy. I think that's the real luxury in life, isn't it? So if I want to get up late, get up late. If I want to have a slow morning, have a slow morning. If I want to read some books, read some books. I want to spend more time with my kids and my wife and my spouse, whatever, then I get to choose that. How amazing is that? Instead of going that daily grind, right? So there's a thing I remember when I was working in tech, we had the same a SSDD. You ever heard of that? So same every different day. And life is really inspiring. So you mentioned about your uncles, about like self-improvement. So is that how you started your self-improvement journey, your personal growth? And can you tell us more about that?
Yeah, actually, it's interesting. So Alan and I are friends through the Tony Robbins community. And one of my uncles that I was mentioning earlier, he actually had personal power tapes. So these cassette tapes, these white cassette tapes that he would put into his minivan cassette deck. And so when we'd be driving to go on vacation for the weekend, we would drive from Los Angeles into Big Bear, which is like this little kind of lake, foresty area. And so it'd be like a 2.5 hour drive, and he'd throw on these cassettes, right? And I'd be hearing Tony Robbins, right? And he's just, and back then, we didn't have our own personal devices, so we just listened to whatever song, on the speakers. But what was really awesome about that, Alan, was that, you start to pick up some of these nuances, and Tony's talking about, our physiology and the things that we value and these needs that we have. And so, through osmosis, and part of it is pure luck, right? Just being in the right place at the right time, being in proximity, by being able to, I think, start to get ideas of what's possible. I think that really started my personal development journey. And I do definitely attribute a lot of that to, my so-called worldly success, right? In the terms of, financial success and whatnot. Because a lot of times, especially for me, I would have never done what I did, except I had a different belief than other people. I believed that you could live a different life. You didn't have to have a 9-to-5 career. You could actually become an entrepreneur, or you could invest your money along the way and give yourself a critical mass to where you can essentially, do whatever you want, whenever you want, because you're not worried about the basics of finances and having to pay your mortgage and your food and your taxes and that's, things of that nature. So yeah, it was definitely, I would say Tony Robbins was a pretty big catalyst in my life of being able to at least launch some of those ideas.
Gosh, I remember those old days, right? The tape, like, when the tape comes out, you got to rewind it with a pencil.
The pencil, right?
If you're old enough, right?
We're dating ourselves.
Yeah. How old were you back then when you're listening to the cassette tape? How old were you back then?
I must have been about 9 or 10.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay,
so pretty young.
Parents, you hearing that? Michael has been starting on that path to personal development ever since he was 9. So the whole thing we talk about in Remarkable Parenting Academy is that you want to start your kids as young as possible, like not until like 20s and you get into personal development. It's if you want to give the kids a head start them with them now. Really that Michael talked about the mindset, right? Because we talked a lot about growth mindset in my academy, and it's all about that, having that growth mindset and continue learning, continue absorbing. And then, which is dovetail to question number 3 is, I understand this life is not always going to be a smooth ride. So what happens when you ran into challenges in the past? Of course you have, everybody has. So how do you handle setback and challenges? Because anybody can be a millionaire or a trillionaire or whatever, and they'll be happy, right? But then how do you handle setback? Because I really want to dive into that mindset, right? So, and really turn that into focusing on a rich life.
Yeah, that's a great question, Alan. And again, I feel very fortunate that I was, given some of these ideas by Tony. And so one of the things that really stuck is the power of perspective, right? So when things did inevitably go wrong in life, which happens to all of us, right? We always have the power to shift our perspective, right? We can't change what's happening, can't change what's happened in the past, but we can always take responsibility for what something means. And so, I'll give you a very specific story. When I was growing up, we grew up in a decent, middle class kind of family or whatever. We had a comfortable house, and then my parents got divorced. And so to me, that was, I would say pretty impactful in the sense that I didn't get to see my dad as much. My mom had to go back to work, and the size of our house got chopped in half, right? And so all of a sudden, all our things shrank. And for a lot of us, right, it's a lot harder once we have something and then to not have it, than to not have it and then have something, right? And so getting into a situation like that, I was just like, feeling very down and just like, this sucks, and why does this happen? And the opportunity that ultimately arose, and it didn't happen instantly, right? But again, because I'm having Tony in my ear, and this actually led me to actually pick up one of his first books ever called Unlimited Power. And so I literally ended up reading that book at the age of 13. Even that small span of time, 3 years or whatnot, I started to continually start to shift perspective. So I'm like, okay, well, what else could this mean? Well, this means that I'm going to grow. It's going to be something that's going to allow me to learn. And these bad times are not going to last forever, right? And so I think really for kids, I do want to say that some of this I was not necessarily consciously contemplating, but if you put yourself into this environment, if you put yourself into some of these environments where you're learning some of these ways to shift perspective, you almost start to kind of absorb it through osmosis. And then inevitably you start to get a better, more positive outlook. And you're like, oh, this could also mean that, it's an opportunity. And so that's what I really did. And I've adopted that, when I finally became conscious of that idea, probably later in my teens, I've carried that throughout my life. Because I'm like, what's the worst thing that can happen? Am I still alive? Am I still still breathing? Am I still able to, enjoy life in some form or fashion, no matter how small? And if the answer is yes, then I'm like, hey, well, this doesn't really matter. Let's see how I can manage the situation.
Live purposely, love passionately, and be the most remarkable parent you're meant to be. We'll see you future sessions.